just want to welcome everyone. This is the first monthly Conversations with Tony, and so we're very excited to launch this opportunity to really provide providers really throughout New York City and throughout New York State an opportunity to hear from very important thought leaders on topics that are really very important, pertinent to the work that all of you are engaged in each day. Today we're very, very excited to have Dr. Michael Lindsey with us. Dr. Lindsey is a noted scholar in the field of child and adolescent mental health, and really a researcher who is in search of really knowledge and solutions to some of the most important problems that we're facing in our society: generational poverty and inequality. Dr. Lindsey is also my boss. He's the executive director of the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research at NYU. And he's a professor of poverty studies at NYU School of Social Work. And he's also an Aspen Health Innovators Fellow. So here at McSilver, Dr. Lindsey, he leads quite an impressive team of researchers, clinicians, other professionals who are just very much committed to creating new knowledge, especially around the root causes of poverty, and developing approaches to address the consequences and the issues that folks who are experiencing poverty, really need to face. And Dr. Lindsey's current research, which involves the delivery of innovative interventions aimed at decreasing PTSD and depression symptoms and improving positive parenting skills in child welfare-involved mothers with trauma-related disorders. So also as a researcher in child and adolescent mental health services and receiving support from National Institute of Mental Health, really to develop and test making connections intervention, and really an approach to how do we engage individuals so that we improve access to and the quality of mental health services, particularly among depressed and traumatized teens in schools. And I'm sure for you folks who are out there that you do in fact are treating and addressing and the challenges of both children and adolescents who are experiencing some depression or also results of trauma in their lives. In 2017, Dr. Lindsey was appointed to spearhead NYU strategies to reduce inequality initiative, and that's really throughout New York University, and leading a faculty from schools and disciplines across the university. So prior to NYU, Dr. Lindsey was an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work and a faculty affiliate at the University of Maryland Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Lindsey is a standing member of Center for Substance Abuse Prevention and the National Advisory Council at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. He's also on the editorial board of a major peer-reviewed journal. So he holds a PhD in social work, MPH from the University of Pittsburgh, and an MSW from Howard University, and a BA in sociology from Morehouse College. It's really a great pleasure for us to have you, Dr. Lindsey, to address one of the sort of major challenges in mental health services for children and adolescents. We know that there's so much unmet need there, and that one of the areas that you're particularly interested in is, what's the experience of children and adolescents of color in terms of the access to and quality of services that are received, and particularly some of the concerns around the uptick in suicide and self-harm, which I know for many of the folks who are listening in, that's an area of real concern. But we're curious to kind of know, you could have studied a lot of different things, but you decided to study this, right? So tell us a little bit about how that interest developed in you, and why you've decided to devote so much of your professional work to this particular area.
Great question. For me, Tony, it's both professional and personal, right? So professionally, I was a practicing clinician, and I did my clinical work in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm from. And as a clinician, I struggled with engaging families, particularly adolescents, in treatment. And I saw a host of issues that we try to understand here at McSilver, whether that's families who are impacted by poverty and struggling with issues around how to, frankly, make the appointment, if it's not childcare, transportation, etc. There was a lot of stigma that I saw among the families and the adolescents we worked with, right? In terms of not really understanding what was happening, interpreting it differently than it being a mental health issue. Kids were thought to be lazy and that sort of thing, right? So those kinds of issues that I saw as a practicing clinician, led me to want to understand what was happening. And our dear colleague Mary McKay often say about her, Mary was one of the first persons that I read about some years ago, and when I went to the literature to look for, strategies to engage families in treatment. But I was concerned that, most of what I saw in the literature did not reflect adolescence. And I knew that developmentally, adolescence is a time where, the adolescents themselves start to gain more volition over their decision making. And so I wanted to really understand what was unique to adolescents about how they come to make decisions about whether to use mental health services, how they define their mental health symptoms, who they talk to, that sort of thing. So that's sort of like the practical, kind of clinical reason that led me to want to do this work. But the personal reason is, I don't always talk about this, but my baby sister struggled with depression as an adolescent, and when we went to identify school-based services for her, there were no services in the school. And of course, as a family, we struggled with how to best interpret and address her symptoms. There were some in the family who thought she was lazy, disrespectful, didn't want to listen to folks, and then there was some like myself who had the kind of clinical background and understood that it needed to be her issues needed to be addressed professionally. But again, there was no school-based mental health services that were accessible to her. Of course, we could provide transportation and all of that sort of stuff. But she didn't want to go to services. And so, that said to me two things. One is that we needed to be doing more work within the families around how kids, come to articulate what's happening with them and to develop the regard among family members for the symptoms and how best to treat them, and then also the importance of school-based work and making sure that clinicians are in schools and are able to be assessed in terms of the kids having proximity to those services. So, those are the kind of, underlying reasons for how I came to focus on this work.
Yeah, what you've expressed is something that I think is very common to the clinicians who are listening in right now and the programs that are providing services to children and adolescents, is that engagement piece.
Yeah.
How do we design our systems so that on that very first encounter, because that's where you kind of make it or break it, right?
Yes.
That very first encounter for a kid who may not see, like, why am I seeing this person? What is this all about? And so I think that this is maybe at the heart of so many challenges that are out there in the mental health system. Is there any, in terms of both where the research was and some of your work, what would be some of the lessons we've kind of learned, or maybe some of the approaches that might be helpful, like do's and don'ts perhaps, around things you can do that's more likely to engage adolescents and children and their families, and the kinds of things that sometimes unintentionally can kind of turn kids off, or even their families off? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, a lot of thoughts.
Okay, good.
So the first part around development, right, and decision making during the adolescent stage of development is really complicated. It's probably the developmental stage at which decision making is perhaps most complicated, right? Because you have two factors going on. You have the adolescent, as I mentioned earlier, who increasingly gains volition over their decision making, and increasingly wants that autonomy to make their own decisions. Right. So imagine sitting across from the kid who says, "I don't want to be here. My mom or dad is making me do this." Right. I've sat across from that kid a gazillion times. Right.
Okay.
And then they exercise their agency. Right. And at some point, if it's not going well, they will leave, and the parent is at their wits' end about what to do about it, right? So there's that tension. What I actually found empirically when I did the research on this with, in particular, Black adolescents, I found that families actually do matter, right? And although it's really complicated, right? Although the adolescents are, again, developmentally gaining more autonomy over their decision making, the caregivers, the family members still weigh in about what's happening. They still check in with their families about their symptoms and what to do. And in fact, in one of my studies, the adolescents said they actually will go to their rooms, or they will be isolated, and they actually expect their family members to notice, right, and to kind of bring it out.
Right.
Instead of being like more forthright and taking, their concerns to the family, sometimes they do it because they don't want to burden their parents with another thing. And again, if economic struggles are, a thing for the family to contend with, the adolescents feel like, well, if I take this issue to them, there's something else that they have to worry about. But they indeed said that they wanted people in their family to bring it out. So what I then kind of was left to sort of surmise from all of this is that the family actually does matter, right? And so with respect to what we do to engage them, one of the key features that I believe and have found this to be empirically true is that psychoeducation about services, about the mental illness itself, whether it's anxiety, trauma, depression, like how the symptoms manifest, what they look like, what can be done about the symptoms, are all really important in terms of developing this kind of psychoeducation strategy with families to explain to them what the symptoms are, and that maybe little Johnny is not lazy, but it's symptomatic of depression, and when a person's depressed, their mood is more heavy, and to the extent that Johnny doesn't want to sort of maybe not inclined to do chores or to do homework. So explaining the nature of symptom expression is really important. And then the other part of that is, what's going to happen in services. First of all, are the services, sort of evidence-based? What has been documented to be, the success of the said strategy or intervention that you plan to use? But then, what's going to happen? How long does it last? What can be the expected outcomes? And I think along with that, exploring the family history of any kind of mental health treatment is really salient and important. We've heard from families and kids themselves that they've had prior experiences that have been negative. And obviously, because that has been the case, they're reticent to be involved in treatment because they're suspicious. Right. Is a therapist going to leave before our time is up? Is a therapist really going to understand my unique perspective and the experiences that I bring to that treatment context? And are they prepared to successfully, sort of work with me? I mean, these are things that, adolescents and their families are thinking about. So the psychoeducation is really important, and the exploration of histories. But then, really exploring things that are going to get in the way of treatment, whether that's concern about what other people are going to say. Whether it's related to the kind of support and regard for their participation in treatment that others might have. Those are I think really core and important strategies that relate to successful engagement.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because even though I've worked primarily with adults and young adults, and at times did work with also adolescents and all, but maybe it's like sort of a universal requirement that when you're engaging somebody for the first time, and they need to make an informed decision about what the heck is this, what's my role in it, what do you do, what's wrong with me, all the questions that folks have, is for practitioners to really think very thoughtfully around how they really communicate for buy-in.
Yeah.
And I mean, the communication for buy-in, as you mentioned, is you got to provide people with some knowledge of what the heck is going on. They're going into the unknown here, or having misconceptions, or absurd conceptions about what this is all about.
Yeah.
That just raises the anxiety. And so having that conversation, and I think that is a really important piece, which perhaps practitioners can sometimes maybe not plan so much. I know that happened to me, where you're just very busy and you're seeing one person. But if you're engaging a family, I think what you're suggesting is the very first thing is think about the kind of information that they need. So one, to address any gaps in their knowledge or understanding. Two, to try to relieve some of their anxiety because they may be thinking all the worst. And then, as you mentioned, some of the barriers for people really engaging, even if they understand what it is, they kind of know it, and you've answered a lot of questions. There are also the discomfort or embarrassment or stigma, those issues that can get in the way. And so that educational piece seems to be like a core requirement for practitioners and knowing how to do it. I think that's my sense of what really is one important message for all practitioners out there, to really think very carefully and thoughtfully about how you present and explain what treatment is about, the purpose of it, the roles, and those sorts of issues. Is that accurate?
That's very, very accurate. And to build on that point, two things that I think readily sort of come to mind for me. One is that in my research with families around the use of mental health treatment, particularly in a school-based context, one of the things that I discovered is that both kids and caregivers actually have negative expectancies about what the treatment experience will be like for them.
So they go in with they don't expect much out of this kind of encounter?
They don't expect much out of it. They think it's not going to solve the presenting issues. They don't have much hope in the therapists. And so these are things before a conversation is even had, right? Like, these are things that that both caregivers and adolescents said that they report to treatment with this kind of, set of concerns, right? And so, building on your point, it is important to have these discussions, and it's important to have them very early, right? To lead the first session or the first conversation around these issues, to be intentional about having conversations around engagement. The things are going to get in the way, the things are going to facilitate, successful treatment. And that's why, for adolescents, I was, encouraged some years ago for federal support to develop an adolescent-focused engagement intervention that we call the Making Connections intervention, to have that precursor engagement session to participation in treatment, building on the work that our colleague Mary McKay has done with adults.
Right.
I wanted to be really specific about what happens with adolescents, right? And we found that doing this work very early actually leads to early engagement, but it also leads to ongoing engagement. And so in the context of delivering an evidence-based treatment, we are actually following the extent to which kids are engaged over time, and we are able to determine the ebbs and flows of engagement. When is it high? When is it low? And what we found is that if you're intentional about doing this stuff really early in terms of engagement strategies, that it does lead to that early engagement. And then early engagement is important for continuous
care.
engagement. Yeah. So you're absolutely right, and I just add that it's important to do it very early.
What I like about this finding is like really important, because I think we as practitioners, if someone's come in like a mindset of like, you can't help,
right?
And my mindset is like, I'm here to help.
Yeah.
And so you have this kind of like disconnect, and I'm wondering if does that vary by ethnicity or race at all, or black families and black adolescent kids, are they, or folks who are in impoverished communities, who have experienced discrimination and those sorts of things. Does that have influenced that mindset? Because I'm just trying to get a sense of how do you even assess, get a notion of, and also is there any variation by various populations?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. Yes, and some of it is related to like historical norms in certain communities of color, where there is, so for example, a family history of, we deal with our issues in the family. We don't take it outside of the house, right? The old adage, you don't air your dirty laundry in public, right? And so we find that for certain groups, that is, really, really important. And in fact, the normative way to sort of go about getting help is to, talk to a family member or maybe clergy. You pray about it. Those kind of things really, matter in terms of whether, care is sought, right? Or, from a poverty perspective, if there are other kinds of competing interest or things that one might be concerned about, taking time out to address your mental health related to the stressors associated with poverty is likely
seems like a luxury.
Yeah, it's likely the last thing on your list to do, right? And so sometimes we've seen people in treatment who have been mandated. And they're struggling with a host of issues around, poverty, inequality, that, again, competes against their interests, right? So in those ways, we do see variability. And then, the final thing I'll say is that back to that family history of how, problems have been resolved and whether professional mental health services have been sought. If there's kind of a family history or some normative experiences around going to a therapist, and that's generational, then one likely is not encumbered by these factors that might otherwise make going to treatment not a priority.
Right. So in some sense, it has to do with the degree to which the mental health system is trusted.
Yes.
Whether there's like really trust in this,
Yes.
And what's been the experience of going to various organizations, right, that are there to help. So you have that piece of it. Then the other piece that I know folks sort of sometimes are concerned about is being able to sort of distinguish between the experiences or the challenges people have because of a mental health problem that they kind of own, rather than the sort of the consequence of social experiences that may be contributing to some of these challenges in terms of day-to-day living. And so, there may be like a sort of a tension there as well. I don't know if they've even counted that kind of a thing, or is that something for practitioners to just be aware of in terms of, my perspective was always as a clinician, look, I'm here to help. You can trust me, not to worry. You know what I mean? I'm really on your side, that kind of thing. And I'm not as conscious of the idea like, well, I'm saying that, this person might be thinking, you're full of baloney.
Right,
you know what I mean? I don't really, I'm not sure about this whole thing. And then the challenge of wanting to be able to establish more of that trust, and also a recognition that social conditions, may also contribute to current challenges and difficulties, and that we don't want to ignore that.
That's right.
Because a person could engage in like thing that there's something disordered with me, rather than some of those conditions. I know that that's an issue. I mean, we talk. This is one of the things here at McSilver that we want to try to better understand. And it sounds like that has some merit to it as well.
Yeah, no question. A couple of things that come to mind. One is that there could be distrust, right? And in large part, I think that it's normal and relevant, perhaps, for there to be distrust, right? We're mental health professionals, researchers, practitioners. We have not always done, our best, right? Whether that's, really steeping ourselves in evidence-based practice and being able to explain to our clients with confidence that X, Y, and Z are about to happen. And the reason why they're about to happen is that we know that this works well, right? There's objective evidence that suggests if we do X, Y, and Z, it's going to have some demonstrative effect, right? And so being able to internalize that if you're a client is really important. I mean, imagine going to a doctor for an invasive procedure, and the doctor says, I have no objective evidence that this is going to work out, right? But I'm just going to try these things on you. And are you game for that? Like, and likely we would be scared beyond, rationality, right?
So you're really making the point that one of our responsibilities is to be able to articulate to a client what we're going to do, why this is important, what's the evidence, what's the basis for believing that if I do my part, you do your part, that we're going to be able to address whatever that issue might be, right? Of anxiety or depression or conduct issues or all those sorts of like concerns, and that practitioners need to be really cognizant of that.
That's right.
That this is, you have to, in a way, it's a responsibility because you're a supplier of something. You have a customer there in a way. It's like saying, what is this? Why is it important? What's my role? How is it going to help? And that helps to kind of address some of the negative anticipation.
That's right. Totally.
It sounds like that's one of the important strategies to use.
No, it definitely is. It makes a difference. It helps to, prepare and to, as much as possible, normalize the experience. Because if I'm hearing, going back to that invasive procedure sort of metaphor, right? If I know that, it's invasive, it's going to be a challenge, perhaps even a long recovery process, but it has worked, in the past for this condition, right? It puts a person at ease, and so I just think it's good practice, both at the clinician level, but also in terms of, agencies and other community-based or, specialty mental health care, to bring in and have an appreciation for the delivery of evidence-based interventions. And I think one more thing, just another anecdote. I was interviewing a kid for a study once, a kid who had depression. a severe case of it, and I asked him, what were his treatment experiences like, to kind of walk me through how does he even, because he was in treatment, how does he even get to an appointment, and what goes through his mind and that sort of thing. And he said, well, to get to the appointment, I have to catch 3 buses to get just to the appointment. And he was talking about going to see a psychiatrist. And he said, when I leave my house, I'm walking down the street, and the kids on the street are,
Right.
saying, "Where you going? What's up? Come hang out." And then the word is buzzing among the group that
Sure.
He's going to see a shrink, right? So then he catches 3 buses. Then he gets to the appointment, and he says, one of the first things that the psychiatrist asked him is, how are the meds doing? And he felt like, it's not just psychiatrists. I mean, we mental health practitioners,
Oh, I've asked the same question.
Yeah,
So I get that.
Yeah, right. And
Exactly.
and so leading with that, and I've asked the same question
Right,
too,
yeah.
without an appreciation for all that it took
I get it.
for our clients to get to the appointment. Really is somewhat, as I frame it, acontextual, right? Because it's not really appreciating all of that happens in their world that relates to the dynamic of being in treatment, and how they view us and how they will appreciate what's about to happen.
Right.
And so I also just kind of call for us as, practitioners and scholars, wherever you find your place in terms of mental health treatments, to really understand those factors that play a role in terms of mental health treatment.
Great. Well, the time has flown by here.
Is it over already?
It's more than we've.
Oh,
It's
my
actually
God.
gone overtime.
Oh, wow.
Which is like great. And there's so many other questions I would have really, and I'm sure folks out there
Yeah,
would want to
yeah.
ask. So let's see if we're just going to ask for folks from the audience who have some questions for Dr. Lindsey. Okay, we have some that are coming in. Okay, so let's go for what tips do you have for therapists who work with family members who express resistance to engaging in therapy? Specifically, the mentality of we don't air out dirty laundry, or they simply don't believe in therapy. I mean, that's really like, and this is something that are encountered by folks out there all the time. And I think we touched on some of those things.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to strategies to kind of engage the family and the child?
Right. So I think it's important to situate mental health and the presenting problems, if you will, why folks come to us for treatment. I think it's important to situate it in the kind of continuum of symptoms and functioning, right? So functioning is really, 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 really key. So, for example, if I'm talking to a family of a kid who's doing really, really bad in school, not wanting to study, not showing up at school, all those kinds of issues, right? And, the kid is assessed, and we find a high level of symptoms, let's say depression. And the scores for depression symptoms are off the chart,
Wow.
right? I have to explain to that family what that kid is struggling with in terms of doing their schoolwork or showing up at school is symptomatic of depression, right? That's a functioning issue,
Right.
because now the symptoms have taken over in terms of how this kid is experiencing the world, right? And I often say this, I've never sat across from a family that, or a parent that does not want their child to do well in school, right? Irrespective of socioeconomic status. And if they're sort of struggling with issues of poverty, they want even more for their kids to
Right.
be connected to school, because they see education as a way out,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think you have to put that functioning at the core of what you're prepared to do to help that kid to be relieved of these symptoms that impacts their functioning such that they can do better in school. Showing up, being able to do their work. So the functioning piece really becomes important if you're working with adults, right? Mental health issues get in the way of their job performance. It impacts their love relationships. And so how do you put the work that you're prepared to do in the context of their functioning? That's missed on us sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're not always cognizant about that, but you have to put it in that context, I think,
right,
in order to really, increase the potential for buy-in.
Yeah, because I think part of it is the kid also wants to do well in school.
Yes.
It's like everyone doesn't want to have all this aggravation.
Yes.
Right? So it's trying to find that kind of functional, kind of common ground here. Let's zero in on goals that are not being met, problems that are experienced by the adolescent and the family, and not necessarily like looking at the symptoms, but that functioning piece is what really people are concerned about, is how those symptoms impact that.
Totally.
So that's a very important message.
Yeah.
About the expectancy of treatment from the clinician's perspective. Can you say more about expectancy of treatment from the provider's perspective? I'm sure if you understand that
Yeah,
question?
I mean,
Kind of
I think about two things. One is what is expectancy and what's informing expectancies, and then what the provider can do about it. Some of which we've already talked about, I think, but I'll just
restate that.
Restate that, yeah.
Emphasize that piece.
Yeah. So expectancies, negative expectancies can be related to prior negative experiences.
Right.
It could be vicarious negative experiences. So if I had a neighbor who struggled with severe mental illness and was in and out of hospitals or in and out of treatment, and the recovery just, going back to that issue of functioning, the person never really was able to function as a sort of working person that's able to go to work every day and unencumbered by all of these stressors. If I saw that, right, I then began to create a narrative around treatment not being effective, right? So then I start to struggle with my own issues.
Right.
And having that kind of experience, personal or vicarious, feeds into my expectancies about what this is going to be like.
Right.
Expectancies can also be related to, we have, in the context of kids, there are all kinds of ways that we define what's happening with the kid. As I've said, from little Johnny being lazy, being disrespectful, all those kinds of things, right? And I saw this in my own family with my sister. I mean, everyone had an opinion about what to do, with her presenting issues. And so then, formal treatment is presented as an option. Oh, that stuff doesn't work. And I had a caregiver say to me once in the study that if I hear that from my social network, it starts to play in my mind, well, maybe this is not going to work. So she said that for her daughter, she went into the treatment context with skepticism. And the thing is, this is interesting, Tony, she said, if I didn't see the results of this, treatment working like right away, I started to play that out in my mind. Well, you know what? In this instance, for this mother, she said, well, maybe my mom is right when she says that therapy stuff is new age, and old school is about being tough on her, punishing her, yada yada yada.
Right.
So all those things feed expectancies, right?
It's so managing expectations.
Yeah.
See, I think part of it is for practitioners to be a little calmer in their work. And what I mean by calmer is that we're going to help you, whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah.
It's just the idea of, let's spend some time. I just want to understand your perspective. We're not going to solve the problem now. We're going to spend a lot of time listening. I want that family and that kid to go away saying, gee, that guy really just listens to you a lot.
Yeah.
Two, he doesn't seem to blame you for anything.
Right.
And gee, he doesn't talk about just problem areas. He actually even says something about the strengths that we have. So it's like thinking about how I want that person to leave this encounter, right? Because I want them to come back.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally.
Like they don't come back, then it's all over.
Yeah.
Right? So how do you get somebody to come back? So I think in many ways that's like ultimately it. And I think the piece that you're really emphasized today, and we just have a minute left, I just want to kind of sort of restate something that I think was so important, is for practitioners to really think about how you have to first have a shared understanding
Yes.
of what treatment is about. You can't really go forward. If the family or the kid thinks it's this, and you think it's that, and you're misaligned, the chances are it'll just be experienced as tension.
Yeah.
We're not really connecting, and then the person's likelihood of coming back is really reduced. So I think that's a very important message out there.
Yeah.
To spend some time calmly saying, like, what do you know about therapy? What do you think goes on around therapy? Let me share with you what I'll be bringing, what the purpose is. All of that, as you're emphasizing, helps to calm things down and to at least to begin to establish some shared expectations. Without that, it's kind of tough to move forward.
Right.
And so I think that's a message that's very practical for folks out there. Well, Dr. Lindsey, I just want to really thank you for giving us and addressing some of what the critical challenges is. This is not really theoretical, right?
Right.
This is research that you've done that has like direct implications of like how we can do things better in a very practical way. And I think it's a very important message out there. So I want to thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been fun. This has been fun. So
Appreciate that.
it.
All right.
Yeah.
And again, folks, you'll be hearing more about our monthly conversations with Dr. Tony. So be on the lookout for more information about that. We will have excellent thought leaders, as we have with Dr. Lindsey, in the months to come. So stay well, everyone, and hope that you found this to be helpful and benefit to the work that you do. Bye-bye now.